When the county assessor laughed at me, actually laughed, I knew I had either made the worst decision of my life or the best one. The land I had just bought was so degraded, so stripped, so broken that nobody in Breathitt County had touched it in 22 years. I touched it every single day for 3 years, and what happened to it is something this county hadn't seen in a generation. Breathitt County sits deep in the eastern Kentucky mountains, in the heart of a region that the rest of America tends to forget exists until something goes wrong there. The mountains here are old, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, worn smooth by hundreds of millions of years into long rolling ridges and narrow valleys called hollows. A hollow is a specific geography, a hollow between two ridgelines where a small creek runs, where the land is sheltered from the worst winds, but catches every drop of rain that falls on the ridges above it. My hollow had a creek. It had ridgelines on, both sides rising steeply to the east and west. It had 18 acres of some of the most damaged agricultural land I had ever stood on. The damage had a history. The previous owner before the previous owner had allowed a small surface mining operation on the upper eastern ridge. Not a full mountaintop removal, but enough. The overburden, the rock and subsoil material blasted off to reach the coal seam, had been pushed down the eastern slope and spread across the lower portion of the hollow in what the industry calls a valley fill. Compacted rock, shale, and subsoil mixed together and graded flat, covering whatever topsoil had once existed in the lower hollow under 4 to 8 feet of mining waste. On top of that substrate, 22 years of abandonment had deposited a thin crust of opportunistic vegetation. Invasive multiflora rose, autumn olive, Japanese honeysuckle, and tree of heaven, the most aggressive invasive tree in eastern North America. None of it was native. None of it was useful. All of it had thorns or allelopathic root chemicals that suppressed anything trying to grow beneath it. The upper portions of the hollow, above the valley fill on the original hillside slopes, still had some remnant native soil. Not good soil. Steep slope soil, heavily eroded over decades of no management, thin and acid and exhausted. But it was actual Appalachian mountain soil, not mining waste. It had memory. The realtor who sold it to me had been straightforward in a way I appreciated. She said, "I'm going to tell you exactly what this is. It's 18 acres of reclamation project in a flood-prone holler with no road access beyond the creek crossing, no structures, and a history that most buyers won't touch. The price reflects all of that." The price was very low. I bought it the same afternoon. Getting onto the property required crossing the creek. In dry weather, the crossing was manageable. Shallow water over flat rocks, passable in a truck with decent clearance. After rain, which in eastern Kentucky can mean 2 inches in an afternoon, the creek rose fast and the crossing became impassable. The holler had its own schedule, and it didn't consult anyone before following it. I spent the first week simply being in the holler, walking it, learning its rhythms. The way the morning fog sat in the low areas until the sun cleared the eastern ridge at around 9 in the morning. The way water moved during rain, sheeting down the steep slopes, collecting at the base of the ridges, running in temporary channels across the valley fill before finding the creek. The way the invasive vegetation had organized itself, denser on the disturbed valley fill, thinner on the steeper native soil slopes where even invasives struggled to get a foothold. The creek itself was both the hollow's greatest asset and its greatest challenge. It ran clear in dry weather, cold, clean Appalachian mountain water over flat limestone and sandstone. In flood conditions, it ran brown with suspended sediment spread across the valley floor, deposited silt, and occasionally moved things, logs, debris, and occasionally pieces of the creek bank itself. Any farm infrastructure in this holler had to be designed around the creek's behavior, not in spite of it. On the third day, I found something in the upper holler that changed my understanding of the land's potential. Behind a dense wall of autumn olive at the base of the western ridge, there was a spring, a real mountain spring. Water emerging from the rock at a consistent flow, cold and clear, running in a small channel that had been partially filled with debris over the years, but was still moving. Mountain springs in eastern Kentucky are significant. They represent reliable, gravity-fed water that doesn't depend on rainfall or well pumps. They represent the possibility of irrigation without infrastructure costs. I marked it on my map with a circle and 2 words. Everything starts here. Before I could make any real decisions about this land, I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with below the surface. The valley fill area was the biggest question. What exactly had been buried under the mining waste, and was there any possibility of growing food in or on top of it? I hired a soil scientist from the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture who had spent her career working with reclaimed mine land in Appalachia. She spent 2 days on the property with coring, equipment, taking samples from 7 locations across the valley fill and 4 from the upper native soil slopes. Her report was 40 pages long. The summary was brutal and honest. The valley fill material was what she expected. Compacted shale and rock debris with virtually no organic matter, extremely high in heavy metals from the coal seam contact, and with a pH swinging between 4.2 and 5.8 depending on location. The acidic pH was caused by iron sulfide oxidation, the pyrite in the exposed rock reacting with air and water to produce sulfuric acid. This was the signature chemistry of post-mining land in the Appalachian coalfields. It wasn't just bad soil, it was actively hostile chemistry. The native slope soil was different in character, but still severely degraded. pH between 4.8 and 5.5, acid, but naturally so for Appalachian mountain soil, and correctable. Organic matter at 1 to 2%, low, but not absent. The biological community was suppressed but present. These soils had a history of supporting the mixed hardwood forest that was the natural vegetation of eastern Kentucky before agriculture and mining. With the right inputs and time, they could support agriculture again. Her recommendation was clear: don't try to farm the valley fill directly. It would take decades of bioremediation to make that material genuinely productive. Instead, use the valley fill as a stable platform for raised bed infrastructure. Build above it, not in it. Focus agricultural production on the native soil slopes using terracing and erosion control, and address the invasive species first, before anything else, because they would undo any soil work as fast as it could be done. I read that report 4 times, then I drew a new map. Clearing 18 acres of mature invasive vegetation in eastern Kentucky is not a weekend project. Multiflora rose has canes that grow 8 feet long with thorns that penetrate leather gloves. Autumn olive resprouts from the root crown with extraordinary vigor after cutting. You can cut it to the ground and have a 2-foot resprout within 6 weeks. Tree of Heaven produces allelopathic chemicals from its roots that suppress the germination of native plants in the surrounding soil for years after the tree is removed. I attacked it in zones, starting with the spring area and working outward. The spring had to be cleared and protected first. It was the water source everything else depended on. The clearing method I used for woody invasives was cut stump treatment, cutting each stem close to the ground and immediately applying a concentrated herbicide solution to the cut surface. This kills the root system rather than triggering the re-sprouting response that cutting alone produces. It is slow, precise work. Each stump has to be treated within minutes of cutting, or the cut surface seals and the treatment is ineffective. I worked through the spring clearing for 3 weeks. My hands learned the difference between multiflora rose thorns and autumn olive thorns by touch in the dark. My forearms carried the marks of that work for months, but the spring emerged, cleared of the autumn olive that had nearly buried it. The spring was more significant than I'd realized. A flow rate of roughly 2 gallons per minute, consistent across wet and dry periods, cold enough to keep your hand numb in 30 seconds. I built a simple spring box from concrete block to collect and protect the flow, and ran black polypipe from it down the hollow slope to the main production zone 300 feet below. Gravity, cold mountain water, free. The native soil slopes on both sides of the hollow were too steep to farm conventionally. Slopes above about 8% grade lose topsoil to erosion faster than any amendment program can replace it. Rain hits the surface, runs downhill, and carries the finest soil particles with it, leaving coarser, less fertile material behind. The native soil slopes in my hollow were running between 15 and 30% grade in most places. Farming them without terracing would be farming backward. I built terraces by hand and with a rented mini excavator over the course of 2 full months. Each terrace was a level or slightly back-sloped platform cut into the hillside, wide enough to accommodate a growing bed and a walking path. The cut material from the upper side of each terrace was used to build the lower edge, a compacted berm that retained the level surface and slowed any water that did move across the terrace face. The terraces followed the contour of the slope precisely. I used a simple A-frame level, 2 legs of equal length with a crosspiece and a plumb bob to mark the contour lines before cutting. The A-frame level is one of the oldest agricultural tools in human history. It works perfectly in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. I built 11 terraces on the western slope where the soil was slightly deeper and the aspect caught the afternoon sun. 7 on the eastern slope where the morning sun was excellent for cool season crops. Each terrace was between 30 and 50 feet long and 4 feet wide, enough for 2 planting rows with a working path between them. On the terrace edges, the berms, I planted a mix of native grasses and perennial legumes. The roots of these plants would hold the berm structure against rain. The nitrogen-fixing legumes would begin building the depleted soil chemistry, and the above-ground biomass could be cut periodically and used as mulch on the growing beds above. The terraces changed the hollow. Walking up the western slope after they were finished, looking at the series of level platforms stepping up the hillside, each one a future growing space, was one of the moments in this whole project that I feel most clearly in my memory. The land had been reorganized, made workable, given a new geometry. The valley fill platform, flat, stable, wrong chemistry for direct planting, became the infrastructure zone of the farm. If I couldn't grow in it, I could build on it. The main barn went up on the valley fill, a timber frame structure using locally milled eastern Kentucky oak, built with the help of 2 neighbors who knew timber framing in the way that people in this part of the mountains have known it for generations. The oak came from trees cleared during the terrace construction, nothing wasted. 12 large raised beds were constructed on the valley fill surface, timber-framed boxes 4 feet wide and 12 feet long, with bottoms of heavy landscape fabric over compacted gravel to prevent the valley fill chemistry from migrating upward into the growing medium. Each bed was filled with a custom mix, composted hardwood bark from a sawmill 20 miles away, aged horse manure from a farm up the road, limestone to correct the acidity, and topsoil from the terrace-cut material screened through hardware cloth to remove rocks. The raised beds on the valley fill were isolated growing environments sitting on top of a damaged substrate. The damage below them was irrelevant. The growing medium above was excellent. The spring water arrived at the valley fill zone through the polypipe from 300 feet uphill. Enough pressure from gravity to run simple drip irrigation through all 12 raised beds without a pump. I connected the spring box outlet pipe to a simple filter housing and a pressure regulator, then to the drip main line. The spring fed the farm. Eastern Kentucky has a growing heritage that is older than the United States. The Cherokee and the Shawnee farmed these mountains for thousands of years before European settlement. The Scots-Irish and English settlers who came into the hollers in the 18th and 19th centuries brought seed varieties that adapted over generations to the specific conditions of the Appalachian climate. Short growing seasons, acidic soil, high rainfall, high humidity, temperature swings between ridge and holler that could separate frost dates by 2 weeks. I planted with that heritage in mind. Greasy beans, the Appalachian heirloom pole bean variety that has been grown in eastern Kentucky for over 200 years, named for their smooth, slightly glossy pod surface. They went on the western terraces, where the afternoon sun gave them the warmth they needed. I used seed I had gotten from an elderly woman 3 hollers over who had been saving the same variety since her grandmother gave it to her. Ramps, wild leeks that are the signature spring vegetable of the Appalachian Mountains. They grow naturally in rich, moist, north-facing slopes under hardwood canopy. I transplanted ramp bulbs to the eastern slope terraces and under the recovering hardwood edge at the upper holler, not a crop I would harvest for 2 or 3 years, but a permanent, self-sustaining food forest element that would eventually produce every spring without replanting. Mountain ginseng, the legendary Appalachian medicinal root that grows wild in these mountains and has been harvested to near commercial extinction over the past century. Ginseng cultivation in eastern Kentucky is a meaningful enterprise. The roots take 5 to 7 years to reach harvest size, but bring extraordinary prices from buyers in the herbal medicine market. I planted ginseng rootlets in the shaded eastern slope under the recovering hardwood canopy. A 7-year investment. An Appalachian inheritance. Potatoes, corn, squash. The 3 sisters of Native American agriculture adapted over centuries to exactly this climate and these acidic mountain soils. They went into the raised beds on the valley fill first, where the controlled growing medium gave them the best start. I had known from the beginning that flooding was a reality I had to design around rather than prevent. You cannot prevent a creek in eastern Kentucky from flooding. You can only make sure that when it does, your farm absorbs the event and keeps going. The creek flooded 4 times in the first year. The first 3 floods were manageable. The creek rose, spread across the valley floor, deposited a thin layer of silt, and receded within 12 to 24 hours. The silt deposits were actually beneficial. Creek silt in eastern Kentucky is mineral-rich material from the eroding sandstone and limestone of the surrounding ridges. Each flood left behind a thin layer of natural amendment. The 4th flood of the first year was different. A 2-day rain event dropped 4.5 inches of rain on the watershed above the holler. The creek rose to a level I hadn't seen, 3 feet above normal, moving fast, carrying logs and debris. The water reached the lower terraces on the western slope. It reached the edge of the valley fill platform. It did not, just barely did not, reach the raised beds. I stood in the barn doorway watching the creek at its peak, watching the water level against a stake I'd driven into the creek bank at the highest point I'd thought possible. The water was 8 inches below the top of that stake. 8 inches. I raised the valley fill platform berms by 12 inches the following week. I rebuilt the lower terrace retaining berms with rock-faced walls instead of compacted soil. I planted the creek banks immediately above and below the crossing with native willow and elderberry, deep-rooted plants that would stabilize the banks and slow the erosive force of flood. Water. The creek flooded twice more in year 2. Neither event came close to the infrastructure. The creek was not my enemy. It was my most demanding teacher. Year 2 brought a crop failure I hadn't fully prepared for. The greasy beans on the western terraces, the heirloom variety, the 200-year-old seed, were hit by bean mosaic virus in July. The virus spreads through aphids, and the hollow, with its sheltered, humid microclimate, had generated an aphid population that I hadn't anticipated or controlled early enough. By the time I identified the virus, it had spread through most of the bean planting. The leaves mottled and puckered, the pods set poorly. The harvest was a fraction of what it should have been. I lost most of the bean crop. I sat on the bank above the creek one evening in August with the loss fresh, and I went through the mathematics of it. What the beans would have brought at market. What I'd invested in seed and labor and terrace preparation. What the gap meant for the season's income. The numbers were hard. But I also looked at the terraces. The structure was still there. The soil was better than it had been a year ago. Organic matter building, pH improving, earthworm populations visible now in the beds where none had existed before. The ginseng under the eastern slope hardwoods was alive and growing invisibly underground. The ramps were establishing. The spring was running. The crop had failed. The farm had not. I ordered beneficial insect habitat seed mix that evening and planted it along the upper edges of all the western terraces the following week. Flowers and herbs that would support the predatory insects that eat aphids, lacewings, parasitic wasps, ladybugs, the biological controls that had been absent from this damaged landscape and needed to be invited back. Year 3's beans were clean, every row. Breathitt County people watch things carefully and say little until they have something worth saying. My nearest neighbor, a man named Cecil, who had farmed the holler above mine for 40 years with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided long ago that leaving was not an option, had watched me work this land from a respectful distance for 2 full years without comment. In the spring of year 3, he appeared at my creek crossing one morning carrying a paper bag. Inside the bag were 6 seed packets, varieties he had been saving for years. Greasy beans, a different strain than mine, a half-runner. Bean his wife's family had grown for 3 generations. A tomato variety called Mortgage Lifter that had been developed by a West Virginia farmer in the 1930s and had been growing in Appalachian gardens ever since. He set the bag on the hood of my truck and looked at the terraces on the western slope for a long moment. "You built them right," he said. "Contour is right. Berms are right." Coming from Cecil, that was a doctoral thesis of approval. I planted every seed in that bag. By year 3, the 18 acres of the worst land in Breathitt County had become something that people drove the county roads slowly to look at. The western terraces were in full production. 11 levels of greasy beans, tomatoes, squash, peppers, and herbs stepping up the hillside in a pattern that was part Appalachian farming tradition and part careful modern soil science. The eastern terraces were in the 2nd year of their ramp establishment, wild leeks spreading slowly and naturally across the shaded slope. The ginseng under the eastern hardwoods was in year 2 of its 7-year growth, invisible above ground, building its valuable root below. The 12 raised beds on the valley fill were extraordinarily productive. 3 seasons of careful amendment had built a growing medium that the soil scientist from UK who had written the original 40-page report came back to examine. She pressed her hand into one of the main beds and looked at me. "I didn't expect this," she said. "What did you expect?" I asked. "I expected you to give up by now," she said, with the honesty that good scientists have. "Most people do." The spring still ran, cold and clear and consistent through the driest summer weeks. The creek had not touched the infrastructure since I raised the berms after the first-year flood. The barn, Eastern Kentucky oak, timber-framed, was solid and permanent, and smelled like the mountain forest it came from. Cecil came to the farm in late summer of year 3 and walked, every terrace. He examined the contour, the berm condition, the soil color. He looked at the beans. He pulled a handful of the raised bed soil and crumbled it between his fingers. At the bottom of the western slope, he turned and looked up at the terraces stepping above him. "My grandfather terraced a slope like this," he said. "Nobody does it anymore." "Somebody does," I said. He almost smiled. Almost. "You asked what happened when I bought the worst land in the county. Here is what happened." Oh, holler that had been strip-mined, abandoned, invaded by non-native plants, and written off by everyone who knew it became a working farm. Not despite its history, partly because of it. The valley fill that a mining operation had deposited became the most stable platform on the property, now supporting 12 raised beds and a timber frame barn. The spring that had been buried under invasive vegetation became the farm's entire irrigation system, running on gravity from 300 feet above. The creek that had flooded and scared me became the farm's most reliable soil amendment source, depositing mineral-rich silt with every event. The terraces on the western slope are now in their third year of production. The ramps on the eastern slope will be harvestable next spring. The ginseng under the hardwoods is building its roots slowly in the dark, 5 years from a harvest that will bring more per pound than almost any other crop I grow. The greasy beans that Cecil brought me in a paper bag are growing on the third terrace from the top. The same seed his wife's family saved for 3 generations, now growing in soil that a soil scientist said was too damaged for agriculture. Seeds remember what soil forgets. I bought the worst land in the county. Here is what happened. The land became the best thing I ever did.